Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Asan Plenum. Session 1 on the topic of NATO will now begin. The moderator for this session is Professor Choi Jin-woo, the director of the Hanyang Peace Institute at Hanyang University. Professor Choi, if you please.
Yes. Thank you. I'm very glad to chair this session with these all renowned people in front of you on such important subject like NATO. NATO may not be very famous in Korea and may not get very much attention in Korea, but its significance in world affairs is increasing, I believe. And it certainly will have some roles to play, not only in Europe, but also in East Asia in coming years. And as the panel description says, this year is the 70th anniversary of NATO. It was created and established in 1949, April 9th, I believe. I'm not sure though. And 70 years of sustenance is no easy feat for a military alliance in this international system of sovereign states. I think the average longevity of all military alliances that existed on the earth is something like 15 years. And there are many others who had a shorter life in the history. Okay. NATO has been very successful in the past, bringing stability and prosperity to European continent. And it has been very successful in adapting to new environment since the end of the Cold War. It was created for stopping the Soviet power from expanding to Western Europe in 1949. But after the Soviet Empire disappeared into the history, it still survived and until today and play a significant role. Okay, but it also has a lot of challenges ahead, and it is facing a lot of new tasks. And the panel description addresses many issues like burden sharing and the Russian problem that gets more and more aggressive, and counterterrorism, cybersecurity, cooperation with countries like South Korea, dealing with the decline of U.S. leadership and commitment, and etc. and etc. And one thing that the panel description does not address is the China issue. I think this is the most important, topic for discussing NATO in South Korean context. China is, as we all know, rising fast, and it brings about a lot of changes and challenges to our world. And I'm wondering, can NATO remain relevant in this volatile time where China is rising fast, not only in Europe, but also in world affairs as well. So I would like to hear something about the China issue from the panelists, if possible, in addition to the issues addressed in panel description. Okay, because we have only 90 minutes for this session, which is not very abundant for a discussion for this important topic, so I will skip the introduction of the panelists because you can read them in a booklet, and I think you know all the panelists because they are renowned people, as I said. Okay, I will give each panelist like 7 to 8 minutes for a talk for a first round, and then after the first round, maybe you could have a couple of minutes to respond to each other if you find any differences or any questions or any comments or whatever. And then we will open the floor and get some comments and questions from the audience. Okay. First, let's listen to Mr. Ian Anthony. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess the task is to respond to a certain extent to your introduction. I mean, as you rightly say, NATO has existed for a very long time now, and I guess that is a testament to the flexibility of the alliance, which is really the place where European countries can coordinate their military policies with the United States and Canada. And that's a task which is probably required in perpetuity. So not only does NATO have a long past, but it has a rather solid foundation, I think, for continued existence long into the future. As you rightly say, that doesn't mean that there aren't significant challenges that have to be met. You drew attention to the issue of relationship with Russia, and of course, after 2014, there have been very significant changes as NATO goes through its latest phase of adaptation, and these changes still have to be fully implemented. But I think that is going to be probably the central task for the near future. What happened in 2014, I think, was a shock. When Russia annexed Crimea, it crossed the reddest of red lines within the European security system, which we thought we were building after the end of the Cold War. And then the conflict in Ukraine, which took on an intensity which has now led to more than 10,000 deaths, meant that major conflict had returned to the heart of Europe, if you like. And there was a recognition and an awakening that many countries were simply not prepared should some similar contingency arise. That doesn't mean that such a contingency was predicted or considered probable, but certainly there was a recognition that if it should happen, preparations weren't in place. So really, since 2014, there's been quite a rapid pace of adaptation and new initiatives taken. There are other panelists who can speak with greater authority on that than I can. But it means that the alliance has really gone into this latest phase of adaptation with a renewed sense of purpose, I would say. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the other issues that you raised. But to me, the question of the relationship with Russia, to a certain extent, has now been put onto a path which is somewhat predictable. Some of the greater challenges perhaps lie to the south and to the southeast. Finding a common view on what, if any, military tasks might be required in the stabilization of the northern part of Africa. This is a major problem. The Middle East, obviously, has also become a seat, again, of major conflict, coming closer to NATO's borders, including direct engagement by Turkey, for example, in Syria. So this Russia question, although it's an extremely serious one, it's one where a pathway has been defined and a process of implementing decisions is now underway. Some of these other challenges are perhaps the things that we still have to find common approaches towards. Mm-hmm. And it's this practice of seeking common approaches which is probably NATO's greatest strength. The coherence which can be achieved within the group of states that participate in the alliance is its major asset. So this is where probably the focus will have to lie.
Okay. All right. Okay, next speaker, Mr. Pascal Boniface.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, as you have stated, NATO is very successful because it has been created 70 years ago. It's still existing and even stronger than at the beginning. And even the end of the Soviet threat has not put the end of NATO, but NATO is even stronger now than it was during the Cold War because NATO has new mission, new members. France is fully integrated in 10 years from now. And so it's a real stronger alliance. But nevertheless, we have some difficulties, internal and external. Internal difficulties, it's the way Trump is dealing with NATO because he's the boss of the free world and he has put into question the existence of NATO. So it was a shock for Europeans. And as Jan has stated, of course, the Russian attitude is also a big concern because it was a change of boundaries in peacetime and it's a first change of boundaries by force since the end of the Cold War. But I think that it's a paradox. We have now the Western countries, both European and USA, less relationship with Moscow than during the Cold War. So it's quite ironical to see that we had with Brezhnev stronger relations than we had with Putin. And I think that NATO enlargement has been a mistake because both Mitterrand in France and George Kennan in USA has warned against a too broad enlargement. And the result was tension and crispation from Moscow. And it's not to give an excuse to the annexion of Crimea, but it's to give an explanation. And we have collectively considering Russia as the loser of the Cold War and not as a partner in the New World Order. And we're still paying the price of this mistake. And one day or the other, we must resume new links with Russia. I don't know if the new Ukrainian president will be able to do it. But frankly speaking, it's a dream to think that Moscow will give back Crimea to Ukraine. Because first, the Crimean population will refuse to become Ukrainian again. And, and we have to deal with that. And of course, Moscow is a strategic challenge, but not really a military threat. The military budget of Russia is $60 billion. European NATO countries, $250 billion. And USA, $720 billion. So, of course, Putin is not a Democrat, his justice is under control, and so on and so on. But there is any chance to see Russian tanks arriving in Paris or in Berlin like we feared it could be the case during the Cold War. So we have to deal with a problematic Russia, but not a military threat as itself. The second problem is Trump's reluctance to adhere to NATO, to stick to NATO. But I think that the threat to give up and to pull out of NATO are not real because it's very in US interest to be inside NATO. And remember, in fact, Trump's threat is to ask to European countries to spend more on militaries. It was the same case with Mike Mansfield, a US senator in the 60s, who put an amendment every year in Senate asking to pull out American troops of Europe if European countries is not spending much money on military issue. And it's always the debate between burden sharing and power sharing. Because classically, Europeans are asking for power sharing and American for burden sharing. But in fact, when the NATO budget, it's roughly 1.6 billion, and US is spending roughly 400,000 million. So it's 22-25% of NATO spending. It's not so much. And if you look at the military exportation, it's $21 billion every year from US to European countries. It's only $2 billion from European countries to US. So the burden sharing is not so bad for USA, and I don't think that the Pentagon or State Department will accept to put Trump to pull out of NATO. Trump was not able to resume links with Moscow, and I think that NATO is not under threat of a break between European and America. But the way US is dealing with European, for example, to prevent, to forbid them to have a relationship with Iran today, perhaps with Cuba tomorrow, with other countries, we have difficulties inside European, between Europeans and USA. Not all Europeans, because some European countries are very happy with Trump, like Poland or Baltic states, but it's a different case between Germany, France, and even UK, because UK has refused to break Iranian nuclear deal. And it's perhaps one of the first times on a very important strategic issue for US that UK is not on US side. And to respond to your question regarding China, we could understand that the rise of China, not only economic, but also strategic and military in the Chinese South Sea, is a major concern. I'm not sure that NATO is a good answer. Maybe the rise of China is a problem, but I think that NATO could not be the answer to this problem, could not be the solution, because I think we have to deal differently with the Chinese challenge, and not as primarily as a military response. And if we transform NATO into an anti-Chinese alliance, we will create new problem, not new solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay. He raised a couple of interesting points about the NATO's enlargement, and he just said about the NATO's the response to the China's rise. Okay, why don't we continue to the next speaker, Mr. Kestutis, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is the 70th anniversary of NATO, but this year we also mark another important anniversary, and that's 80 years since the start of the Second World War. And I would start with a cautionary note, because we can draw some parallels between 39 and 2019, as I see it. Number one, back in 39, there was a widespread complacency among European populations that another world war cannot happen because the First World War was so horrible. Today we can see similar complacency in Europe, that another war cannot happen in Europe. However, as Jan has put it, we have a conflict ongoing in Europe today with thousands of casualties in East Ukraine. War is happening, it can happen, and it will happen again in the future, also in Europe. Number two, back in 39, the European allies in particular were going out of their way to appease the aggressors, Hitler and Stalin. Even in August 1939, France and United Kingdom were encouraging Poland not to mobilize in order not to provoke Hitler. And we remember what happened just a few weeks later. And today we call it political correctness. So when we see Russian aggression in Ukraine, for reasons of political correctness, we call it hybrid warfare, because it is so politically incorrect to attribute aggression today in Europe. And number three, back in 39, we saw a lot of distrust among allies. We saw failure to uphold mutual defense commitments, and we see again a lot of distrust between American allies and European allies, and in between Europeans themselves. So as a septuagenarian alliance, of course, we have some chronic health issues. Of course we do. But at the same time, we have some very robust signs of good health, even at our advanced age of 70 years. We are an alliance of democracies, and of course democracies disagree and discuss and quarrel, and it is difficult to reach consensus in the alliance. But once we do, it's a very powerful consensus, and we can make things happen. Number two, we are a defensive alliance. We will never respond to aggression with aggression. We will not respond to blackmail with blackmail. We will not respond to propaganda with propaganda. We are a defensive alliance. We will not be reciprocal. If someone attacks NATO territory with chemical weapon, like it happened in UK, we will not reciprocate with chemical attack in the streets of Moscow. It will never happen. That is not to say that NATO is idle. NATO is adapting. It is important to note that for an alliance as large as 29 allies, it takes time to adapt. We have adapted from the Cold War posture, and it took us 20 years, more or less, to adapt into a modern 21st century alliance, which now numbers soon to be 30 members. We have 40 partners spanning the globe, from Colombia in South America to Korea, to South Korea here. We have gone out of Euro-Atlantic area to Afghanistan, to the Horn of Africa to combat piracy, etc., etc., etc. And we are adapting again to the changed environment in 2014. And it was a huge strategic shock, as Ian Anthony put it. Why? Because it shifted the mindset of many allies from a mindset of discretionary era where NATO had the luxury to choose where to go, when to go, what to do, our crisis management operations outside NATO territory. Today, this is not that benign environment. It is a non-discretionary environment where the potential adversaries choose the means to engage, the place to engage, and the time to engage, be it terrorist actors or be it state actors. It's a non-discretionary environment. And because of that, it shifted our perception of time and space as we knew it. In the benign era where we were running crisis management operations, we had all the time in the world because it was on our own terms. And space did not matter because we could take time to move forces where they need to be. With the change in 2014, we saw that Russia can take territory from another European country in a matter of days, also using military force. So that time perspective has gone. We can be facing a short notice attack against NATO at a very short notice. Time is gone. And because of that, we rediscovered geography. The globe is a big place. It takes time to move American forces across the Atlantic and across European theater wherever they need to be. So these were very significant factors in the adaptation of the alliance. We already have come a long way. Many allies, all of them have started increasing defense spending since 2014. We have revised our defense planning. We are adapting our NATO command structure. We have increased training and exercises, including the largest exercise we had since the end of the Cold War, Trident Juncture 2018. So we have done a lot of things. Going forward, we as an alliance need to continue to work on our political responsiveness, especially to be able to make what former Secretary of Defense Mattis used to call to make decisions at the speed of relevance, to be able to react quickly, politically, and militarily if necessary. We need to increase readiness of our forces and our ability to move these forces wherever necessary in the Euro-Atlantic area. And my final point would be on NATO's relationship with South Korea, actually. There are, I think, three important factors at play here. Number one, a conflict either in the Euro-Atlantic area or in Asia-Pacific would have significant repercussions for both regions. They are intrinsically linked, especially so in those global common areas like maritime, like cyberspace, like outer space. There is no such thing as regional cyber conflict or regional outer space conflict. Any conflict in these domains would have global repercussions for either NATO alliance or US-Japan, US-Korea, US-Australia alliances. Number two, we heard this morning that we share the same values, they believe in the rule of law, believe in international law and international institutions. We are on the same side of history. And number three, the health of NATO alliance and the health of US-Japan, US-Korea, US-Australia alliances very much depends on the health of transatlantic and trans-Pacific relationships. So we both depend on US commitment to these alliances, very much so. And in light of that, I see perhaps 3 or 4 areas where NATO and Korea could do together more. We could work together more on the current crisis, which we do, and Korea is contributing, for example, to NATO's efforts in Afghanistan. Korea was cooperating with us in the counter-piracy operation. We have expressed repeatedly solidarity with South Korea in the face of North Korean aggressive activities and blackmail. Number two, we can think together more on the emerging challenges, especially cyberspace and outer space, because these are global commons. And these are emerging challenges, and we only started to scratch the surface. What does it mean to defend in cyberspace? What does it mean to deter an outer space attack, etc.? Number three, we can do more in anticipation. We need to share more information. We need to, these kinds of exchanges as we are having today, we need to share intelligence about the upcoming challenges. And finally, we can innovate together. We NATO have, for example, the Allied Command Transformation in US in Norfolk, which is our innovation hub. And Korea is the leading actor in innovation here in the Asia Pacific. So why not think about joint projects in terms of big data, for example, where Korea is such a great leader. So there are things we can do together. As Secretary General put it in front of US Congress, it is good to have friends, and it is good for NATO to have a friend like Korea. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, Mr. Brooke Smith-Windsor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you to the Asan invitation to address you today on this subject, which I'm going to frame in the context of NATO, South Korea, and the legitimacy of U.S. leadership. And why do I do this? I do it because if there is one, as we've just heard, if there is one common denominator that South Koreans, Canadians like me, and Europeans share since the end of the Second War, it is the security guarantee and indeed the leadership of the United States of America, albeit through different security architectures. So here in 2019, halfway through the Trump era, I think it is fair to collectively ask what makes sustained U.S. leadership legitimate, and what opportunities does it present for cooperation between NATO and South Korea going forward. Very briefly, I want to frame this context in reference to Professor David Lake's 2018 presidential address to the American Political Science Association. He pointed out that in constructing the global order of Pax Americana in the aftermath of the Second War, U.S. authority derived from a high degree of legitimacy in the eyes of West Europeans and Northeast Asian allies on which it was centered. Three types of legitimacy are identified: principled legitimacy, shared values; performance or output legitimacy, mutual gains; and thirdly, procedural or input legitimacy, established practices of decision-making. Now, I would say encouragingly for 70-year-old NATO, as well as in these early days of the development of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which we were talking about earlier, all of those three components of legitimacy still appear to be intact. And I want to really run through those in short order, looking at NATO and the Indo-Pacific strategy in those contexts, and I'll conclude with some remarks about the future of the NATO-Korea relationship. First, to principled legitimacy. Principled legitimacy derives from shared values or norms through which the leader, the United States, promotes and followers accept a moral vision that justifies that leadership. Now, despite 2016 U.S. campaign rhetoric questioning NATO's worth, it can be seen in the U.S. national security strategy, for instance, that in reality, America has not shied away from the NATO alliance. We take, for example, the 2018 Declaration on Transatlantic Security, which reinforced those transatlantic values of democracy, rule of law, individual liberty. Furthermore, the very title of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy also, I would suggest, leaves no question as to the principled approach intended to drive it forward. This includes freedom of the global commons, respect for sovereignty, as well as fundamental civil rights and individual liberty that the U.S. is on record of saying it wishes to jointly uphold in this region and with global partners such as South Korea. Second now, to performance legitimacy or output legitimacy. It refers to an acceptance of a state's leadership by others, an acceptance of U.S. leadership in exchange for gains from cooperation enabled by the leader and to the benefit of all. And in NATO, yes, Trump has been the quintessential deal maker as he is. The message to Europeans has been clear. If America continues to underwrite your mortgage through the U.S. security guarantee, you better make your monthly payments with increased defense spending. And Europeans have responded, in fact. The trend in defense spending is now upwards. According to Janes, 24 of the 29 NATO members increased their defense budget in 2018. And Americans have not abandoned Europe. For example, in Poland, the U.S. leads one of the 4 multinational battalion battle groups as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence to deter Russian aggression. Or consider the 2018 decision to establish Joint Force Command Norfolk in the United States to refocus NATO on maritime security in the North Atlantic, again in the face of the Russian challenge. And when we speak of performance legitimacy in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the words coming out of the State Department are equally clear. And I quote here, the United States is committed to growing our presence in the region because we want Americans and all peoples here to share in the economic growth of 2040 and beyond. And the U.S. military commitment to the region is similarly positioned as a collaborative endeavor with like-minded states like Korea. Thirdly, procedural legitimacy. This refers to putting in place and respecting accepted fora and practices of decision-making to establish checks and balances on the great power or the leader, the United States. As has been mentioned, in NATO, consensus-based decision-making still reigns supreme. And the alliance member states have been careful to conduct negotiations with the United States behind closed doors largely, not through public tweets of Twitter in response to the U.S. president, and this to respect traditional methods of diplomacy. And in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the U.S. administration has in fact not shied away from advocacy of multilateral approaches to decision-making. The Trump administration is on record as wishing to increase engagement with, not undermine, such fora as the Indian Ocean Rim Association and ASEAN. Which brings me to my closing point about where might the future interfaces or relationship of South Korea and NATO cooperation be going forward. Here's just one idea I put forward. How about leveraging U.S. leadership and sustained interest in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific to promote a format that would bring together NATO's longstanding Asian partners across the globe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, bringing them together in a NATO +4 format and not solely on a bilateral basis. Why would this arguably be of some value, you might ask? These 4 partners, like the NATO allies in Europe and North America, renounce territorial expansion and aggression. They uphold respect for the rules-based international order. The point here is that such common values can often lead to common cause and thus make the partnership stronger. And NATO as an organization or an organizational dynamic is an important player in terms of establishing a set of functions that are not found in Asia, not even in the most defense-oriented multilateral forums such as the East Asia Summit or the ADMM+. NATO is of value in 4 key ways: as a political partner, as an operational partner, another means of cooperation with the United States, and as a multilateral school for military interoperability. A multilateral relationship between NATO and its 4 Indo-Pacific partners would give the latter arguably a dynamic to construct a cooperative security regime based on collective actions to leverage NATO's 4 key strengths, as I've outlined. Over the last 70 years, Europe has indeed benefited a great deal of NATO's 4 strengths, creating a stronger overall Euro-Atlantic community for defense and security than if each European member had only a bilateral alliance with the United States. So a NATO +4 dynamic could conceivably help to do the same for South Korea. The bilateral relationship, of course, remaining paramount with the United States, but this does not indeed diminish opportunities to be looked for with respect to multilateral fora to leverage the benefits of U.S. leadership with others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Last but not least, former Ambassador Bushbo, please.
Well, thanks very much. It's good to be here. I regret NATO isn't as popular as the ROC-US alliance or the Japan-US alliance, but I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk about the alliance. And I'm going to be a little less optimistic than Brooke here, as the only American on the panel. But first, looking back at NATO 70 years, it is indeed, as all the commentators keep saying, the most successful and longest-lasting alliance. I think it's definitely a result of the fact that NATO has always been more than just a military alliance. I mean, its political role, even during the Cold War, I think shouldn't be underestimated in creating stable relations among its own members, making war unthinkable in at least Western Europe, and laying the foundation for the extraordinary process of European integration and the establishment of the European Union. NATO also showed its adaptability by not going out of business, as some people suggested, at the end of the Cold War, but transforming itself into a vehicle for overcoming the wider division of Europe, represented by the Yalta system, and laying the basis for a Europe whole and free. Not quite complete. Russia is now an outlier, but I don't agree that NATO enlargement was a mistake. This is also the 20th anniversary of the first round of enlargement, and equally important, the 15th anniversary of the second round of enlargement, which included the Baltic states, which showed that there was no red line at the borders of the former USSR. And let's remember as well that when we began this process of enlargement in the 90s, the strategy, and it's still the vision, is to make Russia an integral part of a united Europe and a strategic partner through a variety of means, including the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council. Partnership seems a long way off into the future, but nevertheless, it is still, I think, a valid long-term goal. But we have to deal with the here and now, and we're dealing with a revisionist or even a revanchist Russia that wants to redivide Europe. And there are legitimate questions about whether NATO is up to meeting the Russian challenge, as well as meeting the many other threats along NATO's borders. I think NATO has made a lot of progress, but now with the election of President Trump, we face an unusually strong internal challenge, namely uncertainty about U.S. leadership, with a president who doesn't have any real understanding of history, no appreciation certainly of the role that NATO has played in securing peace and prosperity for the United States as well as for all the allies, a president who does view NATO in largely transactional terms. It's kind of a protection racket in which we provide the security and allies are supposed to pay us. And he has indeed focused almost exclusively on this issue of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. Until allies pay us what they owe, he's going to continue to view NATO as a bad deal for the United States. And we can't just assume that this is rhetoric, given that there are reliable reports that he's even asked questions about leaving NATO, which unfortunately under our Constitution he could do without congressional approval. Now, that being said, so far the president's bark has been worse than his bite. He may consider NATO obsolete and a bad deal, but his administration has pursued policies that have actually continued and in some ways strengthened, improved upon the policies of the Obama administration. And indeed, as others have said, NATO has gone back to basics since 2014 and restoring its defense and deterrence posture against an aggressive Russia. And the U.S. has actually increased its military presence in Europe. It's increased funding for the European Deterrence Initiative. It's increased U.S. rotational deployments, and its other efforts to help bolster allied capabilities needed to deter Russia. The U.S. was the architect of some of the key initiatives at the Brussels summit last year, including the so-called 430s initiative, in which NATO allies have pledged to deploy 30 brigades, 30 air squadrons, and 30 surface ships able to mobilize in 30 days or less. Now, I would say that there's a lot of good news on the ground, and there's this paradox between the President's own views and his administration's policies. The question is this too good to last? You have to, first of all, assume that we're not necessarily halfway through the Trump era, as much as I hope you're right in that regard, but the President could be reelected. And I think there'll be a continuing challenge to demonstrate to this highly transactional President that it's in U.S. interest to stay engaged with NATO as it has done up till now. And I think business as usual is clearly not going to be sufficient. And that applies not only to the allies, but I think to NATO's partners as well. So my view, and I always say this to NATO audiences, is that the key thing is just let's figure out ways to do more to demonstrate that NATO is still working, that it's still relevant, and that applies to NATO's primary challenge in dealing with the Russians, but also to the many other challenges that NATO needs to at least contribute to, if not address directly. So let me give a kind of a to-do list, and then interested in others' reactions. First of all, this burden-sharing issue is a real issue, and it's not going to go away. And while aggregate defense spending has gone up, there are still some significant laggards, including major allies like Germany and Italy, which doesn't get as much criticism as from the President, but also is close to 1% rather than moving towards the 2% goal. So allies really need to stop making excuses and get serious over the next few years on living up to the pledge that they did make. But I think beyond spending, the allies should look for other ways to make additional contributions to the deterrence along the eastern flank. I recently was the co-author of an Atlantic Council report called Permanent Deterrence, which suggests ways the U.S. could increase its presence in Poland and in the Baltic region. But I think this shouldn't be just a U.S. effort. I think that despite the admirable contributions, including by Canada, UK, and Germany in leading battalions in the Baltic states, I think there's room for more European force contributions to further close this time-distance gap that Kęstutis was referring to. I think Europeans who talk a good game about European defense and strategic autonomy need to put more muscle behind the rhetoric and have a higher level of ambition for European defense. And I think over time, aspiring to contribute upwards of half of NATO's capabilities for collective defense, areas like aerial refueling, precision strike, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all areas where the United States provides anywhere from 75 to 100% of NATO's capabilities right now. It may take time to reach 50%, but I think it would provide for a much more balanced alliance, which would be a more sustainable formula than what we have now, even after Trump departs the scene. On other fronts, I think allies need to get more serious about NATO's southern strategy. NATO unveiled this Projecting Stability initiative at the Warsaw Summit in 2016 and has fleshed this out into a framework for the South, but it's still largely an empty shell. The lead initiative under this rubric is defense capacity building, but it doesn't receive any common funding from NATO. It relies heavily on voluntary contributions by a few nations, and as a result, NATO doesn't really have any strategic impact on helping to promote defense sector reform in partner countries that can stabilize NATO's southern periphery. And of course, the South is not just about projecting stability. We now see an expanding Russian role in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. So NATO needs to bolster its defense and deterrence posture, in particular its maritime posture, if we're going to deter the Russians in the south as well as we're doing up in the north. And of course, projecting stability isn't just about the south. NATO could be doing more to bolster key countries that are under threat from Russia, in particular Ukraine and Georgia. The recent seizure of Ukrainian ships in the Kerch Strait in November is a reminder that Russia continues to feel uninhibited in the use of force to change facts on the ground, and a more unified alliance approach to bolstering the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and Georgia, I think, is long overdue. Finally, the alliance does, I think, itself, but also in partnership with countries like South Korea, Japan, and Australia, need to begin to think through the implications for alliance security of a rising China, which is not just rising in East Asia, but expanding its presence on Europe's periphery as well, both militarily with bases in the Horn of Africa and through the Belt and Road Initiative. NATO has already begun to address the risks of dependence on China for 5G and other emerging technologies, but the allies also need to think about what role NATO could play in counter Chinese cyber threats, Chinese efforts to control critical infrastructure inside NATO and countries on NATO's periphery. This would be, I think, a natural subject for enhanced consultations with NATO's Asia-Pacific partners. I think a NATO +4 format, as well as bilateral discussions of these issues, would make a lot of sense. Afghanistan provided a basis for partners to contribute to NATO operations. That operation may be nearing its end, and I think we need to look for other ways to maintain the military-to-military cooperation and work with the partners themselves to set new priorities for direct military and security cooperation with the alliance. We are unified by shared values. The threats are increasingly transcending any one region of the world, so I think there's certainly a basis for reinvigorating NATO's partnerships with the Asia-Pacific nations, just as we need to reinvigorate partnerships with partners along NATO's more immediate periphery. So I'll stop there. Look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot of issues has been raised, and I don't think I can sum up everything, and I will be able to put together. But there are some issues for debates has arisen, like the prospect for NATO. Some are very optimistic, but others are less optimistic or more or less cautious. And also, Ambassador Bushbaugh disagreed with Mr. Boniface on the issue of enlargement of NATO. It was a mistake, or it was inevitable, or it was a right choice, or what. And also, there are some differences among the panelists over the possible impacts of Trump presidency on the future of NATO. And I also would like to another point, which is related to the NATO's basic function. I think it was created for the purpose of deterrence to Russia, but as many panelists mentioned, the secret to NATO's survival or development is its resilience. And well, the resilience is a good thing, but the function of NATO has expanded not only geographically from original members to new members, it is reaching, out of area mission. And that is a resilience, and that provides the NATO with this vitality these days. And NATO has expanded its task into the area of crisis management. So now the function of NATO can be divided into two parts: deterrence, mainly against Russia, and crisis management in out of area. And it could be a good thing for NATO to have more tasks to deal with. But to what extent? I mean, to what limit? Geographically and functionally, isn't it going to be a sort of overstretch that could strain the budgets and the personnel and even the shared values and everything? So, okay, now let's go for the next round. It doesn't have to be in the order of the list. If anybody of you want to speak first, okay, Mr. Boniface, and then.
I just want to respond to Mr. Palokas on some issue. I think it's very wrong to make a comparison between Putin and Hitler. I'm sorry, but this kind of comparison is not reasonable. Putin is probably a strong man, he is authoritarian, he is not Hitler. He has not for program to make the show. I think it's a real mistake to make this kind of comparison because Hitler is unique in history, and I think it's even an insult to Hitler victims to make a comparison between Hitler and Stalin and Putin. Second point, NATO is a defensive alliance, but to my best knowledge, Kosovo war was not, we were not attacked by Yugoslavia, and we have decided to make a war for some reason, but it was an offensive war without any UN green light and without being under threat by Yugoslavia. And once again, I don't think that we are under the threat to be attacked by Russia tomorrow on one night, and Crimea is really an exception. It's not a precedent. First, because Putin is clever enough not to take the risk to attack European countries, but he has no the tools to do it, because he is he's a leader, a strong leader of a weak country. Only $60 billion of military expenditure. So even if he has the choice, even if he has the willingness, he has not the means to attack us. And in fact, the threat for NATO is disarmament. As a body, NATO wants to survive, and as internationally or not, the temptation to create threat to justify his enlargement and to justify his survival. And I think that we have, once again, we are in a disagreement on this point, but we have made a mistake with Russia in the 90s and the beginning of this century by enlarging, contrary to our pledge to Gorbachev, enlarging NATO, and it will be another mistake to do the same with China.
Okay.
I mean, Pascal, you know perfectly well that no such pledge was given, so I'm not sure why we need to go around that block. I think the enlargement was certainly not a mistake. It was an important element of consolidating democracies in Central Europe.
EU enlargement, yes.
Both enlargements. And in fact, if you look at what happened in the 1990s, as a process of enlargement, the promises that were made to Russia were kept. NATO did not significantly expand its military infrastructure into Central Europe. That's something that only began, in fact, after 2014. And the primary focus of enlargement in the 1990s was to consolidate democratic control over the military, to make sure that practices were in place so that parliamentary oversight would be ensured. These kind of things were genuine achievements in consolidating democracy. And the idea that somehow military infrastructure was projected to the east is simply a Russian narrative that we should contest. We shouldn't simply continue to repeat a narrative which is simply not true. Anyway, I'm not sure we'll get much further with this discussion, but I think some of the points that were raised about the to-do list can in fact be combined. from the perspective of European countries which are seen to be lagging behind in meeting their commitments, there needs to be a narrative about why that's in their interests. And the ideas of making a stronger contribution to deterrence and promoting strategic autonomy are probably arguments that should be made, not simply because they're in the interests of Washington, but because they're in the interests of the European countries to do these things. So the real choice, I think, is as the investments become possible through increased spending, what are the priorities going to be? Will they be near-term priorities to do things in the here and now with equipment that can be bought tomorrow? Or is it an investment in a longer-term perspective to develop European capabilities, at least moving us closer to the US capabilities in some emerging technologies, for example? So I think we'll have real choices to make because more money will be available. But the way to frame those choices is probably to emphasize this strengthened contribution to deterrence, which I think from a European political point of view can't mean nuclear deterrence. It has to mean other types of contributions to deterrence. And the question of building strategic autonomy. I would also say that in terms of the very long list of things that need to be done, we should also take into account that none of this is a set of tasks which NATO has to take on alone. For the last 5 years, I would say, the change in the atmosphere and the building relationship between NATO and the European Union has been really quite remarkable. And so when it comes to things like cyber issues, but also thinking about China, that's probably something which needs to be seen in that context of the cooperation between these institutions. It's been quite remarkable in the last couple of years the way attitudes to China have changed very quickly. Until a couple of years ago, the rise of China in Europe was seen almost universally as a benign and positive thing. It was really not challenged from the point of view of its impact on security or global stability, I would say. But that's changed very much in the last 2 years. And if you look at the recent documents produced by the European Union, for example, the communication which was discussed by the Council a couple of weeks ago, they also really talk about China as a challenge. And they define in that document legislative responses, such as strengthening controls on exports of technology to make sure that they're screened against security concerns, strengthening scrutiny of investments in critical infrastructure, strengthening protection against other types of direct investment, including scrutiny of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And because of the way this document is framed, all of this is likely to lead to legislation in the coming years. Well, I think 3 years ago that would have been almost unimaginable. So the narrative about China has changed very much in Europe. And I think this could be a very constructive area for dialogue, of course, with Asian countries, including South Korea. First of all, to improve our understanding of what's happening in China. We still need to know a lot more and a lot more detailed, granular information about what's happening. And secondly, to think about what appropriate responses would be. And it may very well be the case that very little of that has to do with military responses. But if NATO is the framework which is available for such discussions, then why not? One last point, closer to home. I would say not only Ukraine and Georgia, but European countries need to renew their interest in some of the other countries in the immediate neighborhood of both NATO and the EU, particularly in the Balkans and in Moldova. We need to pay much closer attention to what's happening there, and we need to invest much more heavily, not only in the technical measures carried out by the Commission, but also in political engagement and making sure that we create constructive relationships with Moldova and with countries of the Balkans.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Koshua?
Yeah, thanks very much. A couple of things. First, you asked the question about is NATO running the risk of overstretch. I don't think that's in fact the case. I think it's been wise of NATO to adopt this multiple strategy with 3 core tasks of collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. But I think it's also understood within NATO that NATO isn't always the option of first resort. It's actually important that NATO have a stronger strategic partner in the European Union, which has its own methods and mechanisms for crisis management, and in some cases may be the better choice, as we've seen in particular in Africa, where NATO, beyond some of its partnerships with the North African countries, doesn't do all that much. So I think consensus decision-making kind of limits NATO's capacity for overstretch. I think allies will only agree to do what NATO can handle. But I do think that it was the right thing for NATO to do, not only to intervene in Bosnia and Herzegovina and to end the civil war there, which Bosnia wasn't directly threatening NATO security, but this kind of instability on the European continent, I think, was rightfully seen as a threat to the longer-term stability and integration of Europe. And I think the same rationale applied in Kosovo, where there was a consensus, even though we didn't have UN Security Council authorization, that the acts of genocide and the ethnic cleansing taking place there posed similar risks to what we had just seen just a few years earlier in Bosnia. You could even make that case for Libya, even though NATO should have stayed engaged after it intervened. I think by pulling out, it forgot the lessons it learned in the Balkans and allowed Libya to fall back into the instability that we still see today. I won't belabor the enlargement issue. I'm glad Ian mentioned, Gorbachev himself has refuted the idea that he was promised anything about NATO enlargement during the German unification talks. The issue of NATO enlargement wasn't on anybody's agenda at the time, and the assurances given were regarding the disposition of NATO troops in the eastern half of Germany and nothing more. But as I said earlier, I think we made a very sincere effort, which worked to some degree for many years, even after Putin took over, to have our cake and eat it too, to have an expanding NATO, but also to have a strategic partnership with Russia. That said, I think the Bush administration did not prepare well for the 2008 Bucharest summit, in which it, I think, prematurely pushed the issue of membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia, which they may have been deserving of that, but without lining up the other allies before that summit, without having a parallel Russia strategy as we had in the first and second rounds, I think we sowed the seeds for a lot of the trouble we've seen with the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We can't completely discount a Russian threat to NATO itself. Yes, they're not looking for a major war with NATO. They are deterred, I think, by the forces we have now and the improvements that are underway. But we can't completely exclude the possibility in a crisis of some kind of limited territorial grab, using some of the same techniques they used in Ukraine with little green men and cyber attacks and financing of fifth columns. There's evidence that these things are happening in the Baltic states. Just at the time of the Wales summit, they kidnapped an Estonian border guard on Estonian territory. The Russians don't have any inhibitions about this sort of illegal behavior. So deterrence of Russia is important, but we have to be a multifunctional alliance. We can't be completely Russo-centric. It's important that we pay equal attention and devote significant resources, more significant than we're devoting now, to stability along the southern periphery of the alliance. That's important both to counter the threats themselves of instability, failed states, terrorism, and radicalization, but also to keep the alliance unified. If the southern allies think NATO is neglecting their major concerns and is totally centered on the Russian threat up in the north, you'll have a risk to alliance cohesion, which is sort of our number one asset. And I hope the southern allies need to figure out what they want to do in the south, and then the northern allies and the transatlantic allies need to put more muscle into the NATO southern strategy, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
As a product of NATO enlargement, I cannot not to react to the comments by Mr. Boniface. Look, I think that enlargement was the most successful policy that NATO has ever instituted. It brought peace, security, and stability to a vast area between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, by far. And there is an element in contradiction in your logic saying that Crimea is an exception while enlargement was a mistake. The reason Russia has not tried major land grab against the Baltic states or Poland is because they are part of NATO. And what we have seen Russia do was Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, countries that are not part of NATO, that are just partners of NATO. I've never compared Putin to Stalin or Hitler. What I compared was European complacency we saw in '39 and that we see today. We have been constantly surprised. In 2008, we did not expect Russia will intervene in Georgia militarily. In 2014, no one expected Crimea. In 2015, no one expected Russian intervention in Syria. We keep getting surprised by opportunistic approach that we see from Russia. Of course, we're deterring successfully a major conflict, and I hope we will continue to do so. But as Ambassador Versbo put it, there are other ways, mischievous ways they can employ against the Western alliance, and that is the key point. A word on Trump. There is a silver lining. I don't know if it is a causal relationship, but the Trump phenomenon did contribute to the increase in defense spending, especially in Europe, because there was that sense of foreboding, what if US withdraws from NATO? We need to take more responsibility. I quoted Secretary Mattis. He said very wise words to NATO's defense ministers. He said, the Americans cannot possibly worry about the security of European children more than the Americans. The Europeans have to worry about the security of their own children. And that is the point we need to remember. On China, we, NATO, don't have a China policy yet. And if you have listened to Secretary General's speech to the Congress, that was the one interesting omission. He never mentioned China. He covered the broad agenda that we have, but not China. Why? Because we don't have yet a common agreed policy or position on China, because there are different views among allies. Allies are discussing China, of course, but the jury is still out there. What will that policy be? It is very hard to say at this point. There are risks associated with China, but there are also opportunities, and many European allies especially see opportunities for greater cooperation rather than competition alone. And finally, the last point would be on the potential overstretch. There is, I would say, a bandwidth problem because of how broad NATO's agenda has become over the last 5 to 10 years. The North Atlantic Council meets once a week. And normally on the agenda you have 1 or 2 questions. But the agenda of NATO as an alliance is 50 items, from partnership with Australia to women, peace and security, to deterring Russia, to fighting terrorism, to projecting stability, to capacity building in Tunisia, etc., etc., etc. So there is a real bandwidth problem. How do you prioritize? And it is very difficult to prioritize when you have 29 allies with different security perceptions, different interests. That is why we are a slow-moving alliance. That is a problem we cannot avoid. But once we get to that consensus, then we're able to act.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Brooke, do you have anything
Yeah, sure.
to say?
Let me just pick up on 3 points. First is returning to the China question, the NATO-China question that's been raised. I'd agree wholeheartedly with Ian that really it comes down to a question of threat perception among Europeans. And up until very recently, most Europeans that I interact with, I would say, preferred to view China, or rising China, as a market, as an opportunity, rather than a strategic competitor going forward. Now we've seen, as I say, some change in this regard as of late, whether we're talking 5G or otherwise. However, this orientation of still preferring to view China as a market is still there. One only has to look at Italy, where I currently reside, signing up to the One Belt, One Road as the first G7 country to do so. So what NATO's policy will be, and as has been pointed out, NATO doesn't have a policy yet, will really come down to this issue of threat perception. Now, what has happened, on a positive note, in recent years is that there has been some interaction, of course, between NATO and China. We can look to points of reference to the counter-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden, where Chinese assets were operating, alongside NATO's mission there. Since 2012 or 11, I believe, there have been military-to-military talks as part of confidence building, so this is good news. And the Chinese regularly send delegations to NATO's centers of excellence on different aspects of warfighting for information visits. So that's on the positive side. Now, what happens if things were to go south? And I spent a good deal of time in Beijing a few years ago, and that's one question I was asked all the time is, what would NATO do if there was hot war in this part of the world? If there was conflict either here in the Korean Peninsula, if there was conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, what would NATO do? Well, you your immediate reaction, may be, NATO probably wouldn't do anything because it's far away from NATO. But I just point out, no one would have dreamt that NATO would have been in Afghanistan over 10 years if we had asked that question a couple of decades ago. So first point I would say in response is never say never. When you ask the question about whether or not NATO would intervene, we can really point to 5 de facto criteria of what it would take. 4 at least, maybe 5. And I just summarized them for you. If NATO's to intervene, and it has to be by consensus, generally the allies will ask themselves the question, are NATO's values and interests at stake? Okay, that's number 1. If they can check that box, another question that will be asked is there regional support? Is there regional support for an intervention? Okay. Thirdly, is there the political will to intervene amongst the allies? Ideally, you'd get a Security Council resolution, although the Kosovo case has been pointed out, where allies, the NATO intervened without a resolution. So nice to have, maybe not a need to have. And then the 5th point that's generally asked in this context about NATO intervention or not is the chance of military success. And this is the strategic military advice that the military commanders provide to the political authorities. So if NATO can check 4, maybe 5 of those boxes, if you need the UN Security Council resolution, then you might see an intervention in this part of the world. I doubt you'd get China agreeing to UN Security Council resolution authorizing NATO intervention here. So perhaps the Kosovo precedent would be something to look at. That's the China points I wanted to raise. This issue of NATO survivability was pointed out, and I think that indeed NATO has proven itself over the years to be quite adaptable, and that's why I remain an optimist. One has to remember that NATO has faced so-called near-death experiences in the past. We only have to think of the great debate over the deployment of cruise missiles in the 1980s, or even more recently in 2003, the great division over the US invasion of Iraq, where NATO did not partake in that invasion because, again, decisions are taken by consensus, and a number of member states vehemently opposed that operation, including the French, including the Canadians, for instance, so NATO did not intervene. Great division within the alliance, but the alliance nevertheless survived to see another day. Americans may refer now to freedom fries as opposed to French fries, but NATO continues. So I remain somewhat of an optimist when we talk about NATO survivability. Thirdly, just this question of enlargement. I just want to point out that when it comes to the enlargement issue, and again, membership, I have to remember, because sometimes this is asked in Asian circles as well, membership for NATO is limited to European democracies, European countries. That's clearly stated in the founding treaty. So the treaty would have to be changed if NATO was to entertain membership for Korea or Japan or otherwise. I think that's highly unlikely. Partnership is not. And when it comes to NATO's partnership policy, from the very beginning, NATO has been clear that it's really the partner that decides the level of engagement. So NATO is never the demandeur. NATO, it's not a question of councils in Brussels looking at the map and deciding we want this country to be a member or we want this country to be a partner. It doesn't work like that. The initiative very much comes from the partner. So when we think about the future relationship between NATO and South Korea, the initiative, to a large extent, needs to come from Seoul in defining the contours and the level of ambition that Koreans want to have with respect to that relationship going forward. Okay?
Thank you. Okay, now let's open the floor to the audience. You first, and you, and then please identify yourself first and make your comments and questions as short as possible. Okay,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentations. Stefan Mo, Seoul Village. You mentioned the lack of UN consensus as a weakness, but I see it as a strength for the NATO because you can act when there's a blockage somewhere, particularly regarding Russia or China, key players. So I think it's a very attractive point for potential new members. I think the question that somehow permeates through the debate is, could NATO survive U.S. NATO exit, or then would, for example, European partners be up to the task and up their game? Would they be able to do that? And then regarding extension, I fully agree that it was a very, very good thing, particularly for Baltic states. And my question is more for a player we didn't talk about today, which is Turkey. It's a very significant move, so it's a key European player. It's also a player which is evolving, and I wanted to have your feedback about how you feel about the role of Turkey. It's the return on experience and maybe a SWOT analysis about it.
Okay, why don't you collect all the questions first and then collectively respond? Okay. Yeah, and then.
Thank you. My name is Olga Krasniak, Yonsei University. I'm a researcher of diplomatic studies and foreign policy, but I'm Russian, so it explains why I'm here. NATO was created to contain communism. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. You said, all of you almost said, NATO was created and enlarged from defensive purposes. Well, it doesn't seem from Moscow perspective, so definitely. And it's a classic security dilemma because it's hard to identify intentions of the other side. So definitely enlargement of NATO, it's taken as offensive purposes. American scholar of international relations, John Mearsheimer, he said basically in his latest book, NATO moved to Russia's backyard. He meant Ukraine and Georgia, and finally we've got Ukraine and Georgia. Well, I'm not justifying, I'm just trying to explain. And when you said NATO did not see it was coming, Ukraine and Georgia and probably Moldova are probably NATO intelligence should work better to see it was coming. And Crimea definitely, it's an exception because see what is happening in Crimea. Russia invests a lot of money, builds bridges, roads, anything. Nothing happens in Donbass or Abkhazia, absolutely not. So it's not about spending anything. So definitely Crimea is an exception. But again, I'm not justifying, I'm just trying to explain. But my question, so finally, there are three, well, I'm historian, there's three attempts when the Soviet Union and Russia tried to approach NATO, well, during Khrushchev liberalization in 1950s, early 1950s. Then Gorbachev attempts in late 1980s. But then actually, after first term of Putin presidency, he tried to connect with NATO more closely. And all of these attempts, it was failure. Well, it seems that NATO did not accept Russia's attempt to be closer partners. So it's my question, if after Putin probably would be another attempt coming from Russia. So what do you think about this?
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ambassador of Georgia here in the Republic of Korea. Thank you so much for the insights regarding raising up my country's issues. I think that this is very important to speak about the enlargement because my country is passing the very historical pages about this issue. But I will put as a comment what, from the South Korean perspectives, what is happening on our part of the world and why the NATO enlargement is very important for Moldova, for Ukraine, for Georgia right now, because we are doing so much to get there and to put our reforms on this benchmark where our democratical societies are. I think that NATO, first of all, this is the institution, this is democracy, this is not only the security. I would like to emphasize this issue, and the countries like us, this is very important to be the part of this institution. And what we are doing after the collapse of the USSR, this is that we have the closest partnership between the NATO, and I think that one day we will become the member. And I don't think so that NATO is the threat of the Russia in some point, because we saw the Baltic countries and their relations with Russia definitely change in the different mode, while it was before, we can say some days after the collapse of the USSR. But I would like to say on the other side, which is the South Korean Republic's perspectives, because the Korean Republic is putting a lot of investments in our part of the world, especially starting from the recent administration's move in connecting the Central Asia and beyond the Central Asia and diversification of the routes, meaning the One Belt and One Road initiative. And I think that from this perspectives of the Eastern Asia, is very important to have the stabilized partners. And the NATO is bringing the stability in our part of the region. And that's why that I think that it's very important to keep up this rhythm. And it's for everybody's interest to see us on the same page and to be on the part of the liberal order, which I think that today's the event is about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Shinu. I'm Chung Min Lee from the Carnegie Endowment. I was very surprised that none of you mentioned domestic politics. And so my question to all of you is, what is the domestic political consensus in Britain, in France, and in the US, where I live, in Canada, and in the Baltic states? Because if the consensus is that NATO is going to survive for the next 10, 20, 30 odd years, you have to have a government in place that supports NATO. And so that's my quick question. And my small question is, what about Britain? And so once Britain exits the EU at some point, if it does, will it have any impact on its role in NATO? Thank you.
Okay, we have 6 or 7 minutes left for us to talk about all these issues, and I will give you 1 minute per person if you have anything to say. Why don't you go first?
Well, they're very good questions, so we should try to pay the people who asked them the respect of giving them an answer. Maybe we go in reverse. On the UK, it remains to be seen, in fact, 3 years after the referendum, whether the UK will leave the European Union. But in fact, in terms of security policy, probably the results will not be very dramatic, even if there is a decision eventually to leave. In fact, in the UK, when you talk to people, they have a quite clear hierarchy of participation in different international frameworks for security. The UN Security Council is a permanent member, NATO, various bilateral arrangements, particularly with France, but also with other countries, and some of the smaller groupings which are now being created, for example, in the Northern Europe, are all considered to be more significant than the common security and defense policy of the EU. So when you talk to people in London, not participating in CSDP is seen as one of the very few benefits of leaving the EU. So I doubt if there would be very fundamental changes in that area. Actually, the issue of domestic politics and Turkey are, I think, connected. In my own personal view, Turkey is a bigger challenge to the alliance in some ways than Russia, because Russia's bad behavior makes it fairly straightforward to come to consensus on certain issues. But to claim to be an alliance of values when you have an increasingly authoritarian big country in an extremely sensitive location is going to be a major headache going forward. Thankfully, the Turkish colleagues haven't yet at least cancelled the results of the elections that they didn't like recently, but if that was to happen, that would be a significant blow to at least the narrative on NATO as an alliance of values. More generally, we need to pay, if we're going to really mean that we're an alliance of values, we need to pay more attention to domestic developments, not only in Turkey, but also in some other European countries at the moment. Okay. One word on Moldova. I think Moldova is a case which illustrates this issue of how partnerships form and how alliance enlargement takes place. Moldova has no interest in being a member of NATO, and in fact the Moldovan constitution requires neutrality. What Moldova is seeking is help to persuade the Russian colleagues that their peacekeeping forces are no longer required. Even if there was a rationale in 1992, there is no rationale today for a significant Russian military presence in Moldova, and it's really time for these forces to go home. But the Russian colleagues have made it very clear that in fact Moscow will decide when it's time for them to go home, and their presence is part of a larger geopolitical discussion. It really has very little nowadays to do with the situation in Transnistria. So I think this is a good example. Moldova doesn't seek membership of the alliance, and this is the sovereign right of Moldova as a country, and it's absolutely no problem for the alliance. Okay. Other countries prefer to seek membership.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, in France, the far left and the far right are asking for a NATO bailout, but they are not able to take power together. And the other parties, from the center right to the center left, ask to stay in NATO, and some of them ask to be more vocal, to be more active, to be more heard, but inside NATO, and not to, we have been back 10 years ago, it's no question to bail out again.
Okay.
Specifically to the question on European ability in the case the Americans draw down in NATO. We hear a lot about, and what Ambassador Versbo mentioned, the search for strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy. The problem is we never hear what for, the autonomy for what. Like, a bit like with Brexit, take back control to do exactly what. This is something we still need to hear from Europeans. And on Russia, I fully agree that the dialogue is essential. And there is now, I think, the trust between the two sides, it's at the lowest point in many years. And without dialogue, we will never be able to restore that. Even in the darkest hours of the Cold War, we had dialogue, and that is essential to avoid misperceptions, to avoid miscalculation, and to rebuild trust. So I fully agree on that point. And final point on intelligence and effectiveness of that. Remember Stalin, when the Germans invaded Soviet Union, he refused to believe his own intelligence. Even the Germans were already inside the Soviet Union. So it's a problem of political attribution and recognition of what is happening, not only the effectiveness of intelligence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very quickly, with respect to NATO-Russia, remember the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the Rome Declaration are still intact. NATO did not take the decision, even though the view was generally held that Crimea and events in Ukraine represented a violation of many of the tenets, principles of those agreements. NATO did not rip them up. So they're there. They can be very much reconstituted, revived when conditions so permit. And I think that should be looked on in somewhat of a positive light, despite where we are today. Domestic politics, I can tell you, you asked the Canadian issue, I'd say generally with the possible exception of the Separatist Party from Quebec, there's cross-party consensus that NATO is a good thing for Canada. Canada's been there from the beginning of the alliance's creation, and you only have to see that with the Canadian lead now of one of the multinational brigades in the Baltics. So this is a tangible representation of that. On Brexit, I think Brexit will be good news for NATO in reality. Good news. And why do I say that? Because for the United Kingdom, and I'm British as well, so I can say this as a British citizen, I think that NATO now will be the only show in town in terms of the representation of the national interest in a multinational context when it comes to security and defense. The European Union is not going to be a real option anymore. and perhaps the view that's a good thing.
Okay. Mr. Bushwell.
Okay, on could NATO survive without the U.S., I think it's very doubtful. But I don't think the worst case will happen, but Europe needs to up its game just in case, put some substance behind European defense, and that will actually convince the U.S. to stay on board. On Turkey, very challenging situation right now, both the erosion of support for Western values in Turkey, but also this very concrete issue of the Russian S-400, which is simply incompatible with Turkish acquisition of the F-35. This is not a bluff by the U.S. Either Turkey will have S-400s or F-35s. It will not have both. I don't know how we're going to solve this issue, but I think Turkey ultimately doesn't want to lose its NATO security guarantee, despite the very fraught relationship we have right now. And I hope some face-saving solution for Turkey can be found. Agree on the NATO-Russia partnership. If Russia gets back into compliance with the principles of the Founding Act, which are the same principles that Russia helped write into the Helsinki Final Act in terms of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, peaceful resolution of disputes, then we can envisage a kind of a renewal of a NATO-Russia partnership, and I would very much like to see that. I helped negotiate the NATO-Russia Founding Act. I feel very sad that it's under challenge. But I think Russia has to start looking more objectively at NATO. And it's interesting that the Russian military deployments on its western frontier went down after NATO enlargement round 1, went down after NATO enlargement round 2 to the Baltic states. This is through Russian official data provided in the CFE framework. So Russia didn't, at the beginning, see a military threat. NATO didn't deploy substantial combat forces or nuclear weapons. I think it's in President Putin's interest now to create this bogeyman of NATO as a tool of domestic political control and as a justification of efforts to subjugate countries like Ukraine and Georgia to Russia's will. We have to see this as what it is and stand up for Ukraine and Georgia. And in this regard, I would say that it's in South Korea's interest, to support Ukraine and Georgia as well. These are not faraway countries of which Koreans know little. The whole future of the international liberal order is very much on the line in Ukraine, especially with Russia waging active war in eastern Ukraine, even though it lies about it. There are Russian troops there, and the separatists are fully armed, trained, financed by Russia. The latest state-of-the-art Russian weaponry is deployed in eastern Ukraine in the hands of these alleged separatists. So the international order is very much at stake if Russia gets away with what it's doing there. And the same applies to Crimea. It may not be resolvable in the short term. Russia is investing a lot in terms of infrastructure. But the takeover was illegitimate, the referendum was illegitimate, and I think ultimately as Ukraine succeeds, and this is where Korea has an interest in seeing Ukraine succeed, Russia will see that there is a better alternative for Russia itself. Consolidation of democracy and reform in Ukraine will ultimately set a good example for Russia itself. Okay, and then they'll realize that they need to give back Ukraine to the Ukrainian people where it belongs.
Okay. 2 years ago, I read an article on New York Times which says that, I think it was Donald Tusk, who is the president of the European Council of the European Union. He said that Europe is facing several threats. First one, Russia. Second, China. Third, United States under Donald Trump. And Professor Lee Jung-min from Carnegie Mellon just raised another challenge that Europe is facing domestic politics. As the NATO, as NATO member states has to pay more and more money to the NATO expenditure, I think it is likely that the NATO could be more politicized in the domestic politics of member states, and in that case, the NATO have to deal with another front of challenges. Okay, for the last 90 minutes, we discussed about NATO and its role, its history, its future prospect, its relationship with other parts of the country, other parts of the globe. And I don't think we have agreed on anything, but that was not purpose of our session. But it was very insightful, informative, and inspirational. For that purpose, I think the session was very successful. And thank you for your speech and the listening. Let's adjourn. Thank you very much.
This concludes the session on NATO. After a 15-minute break, the plenary session number 2 will start downstairs in Grand Ballroom 1 and 2. The night session on the topic of North Korea's choice, economic reform, will take place in this room at 9 p.m. Thank you very much for attending.